What happens when one man tries to rewrite the fate of an entire civilization? When he bends language, law, and time itself to his will, can it last? Or does it all turn to dust the moment he is gone? I first felt it beneath the red soil of Shaanxi, a quiet hum in the earth just below the surface, the remnants of roads that connected a fractured land, walls that stretched beyond sight, statues that never blink, and a tomb no one dares open. This was the world of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, a man who forged unity from chaos and ruled not as a king, but as a god among mortals. But how did he rise from a child hostage to the most powerful man alive? What kind of philosophy could create such ruthless order, and what did it cost? Why were thousands of books burned, scholars silenced, and traditions buried? How was the Great Wall truly built, and at what human price? And what secrets sleep inside the Terracotta Army and the Emperor's sealed tomb, still untouched by time? In this journey, we follow the rise and fall of the Qin Dynasty, not as distant spectators, but as explorers of the forgotten. Travelers into a world that reshaped history in just one generation. Step carefully, because once you open the first gate, the echoes do not stop, they deepen. The sky was low and gray when I arrived in the central plains of what was once Han. The rain had just passed, leaving the earth damp and fragrant with loam. As I stepped carefully across the uneven stones of an ancient battlefield, my boots sank into mud darkened by centuries. This was no quiet field. It was hallowed and haunted ground where thousands had clashed blade to blade, and only silence remained to mark their names. Long before the idea of China, there were many Chinas. 7 kingdoms, each claiming destiny, each hungering for dominance. The historians called it the Warring States period, but out here, surrounded by rusted relics and overgrown fortifications, it felt less like history and more like a wound still breathing beneath the surface. I picked up the shattered tip of an iron spear. It was crude, pitted with age, but heavy in the hand. There was nothing ceremonial about it. These weapons were not meant for show. They were tools of attrition, instruments of survival. The kind forged not by empires, but by desperation. This era was not simply violent, it was transformative. Bronze gave way to iron. Horses moved faster, bows shot farther, walls grew taller, spies whispered in every court, and philosophers debated power with the sharpness of daggers. It was an age of chaos and of invention. Among these fractured lands, one state grew colder, harder, more relentless: Qin. Far to the west, nestled among mountains and river valleys, the Qin were once dismissed as backward, barbaric, even uncivilized by their rivals. But they adapted, observed, learned. While others fought over pride, the Qin studied structure. While others raised monuments to gods, the Qin raised armies. Discipline, not nobility, became their creed. And they had something else: a land of tough terrain and tighter borders. Their homeland shaped their mentality, inward, cautious, and fiercely unified. The harsh environment did not break them. It bred resilience, the kind of resilience that outlasts sieges and survives generations. One evening near the ruins of ancient Yang, I met an old man tending goats. His family had lived here for centuries. He pointed to a hill and said, "There, they once stood, not kings, not nobles, but soldiers who would become rulers." There was reverence in his voice, not for glory, but for endurance. The Qin did not win through charm or diplomacy. They won because they believed peace could not be negotiated, only imposed. Every defeat was studied, every weakness corrected. Over time, their laws grew harsher, their strategies more calculated. They took what worked from their enemies and discarded the rest. Culture to them was not sacred, it was a weapon to be forged and wielded. The other kingdoms, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi, squabbled, allied, betrayed, and broke apart. But Qin moved forward like a glacier, slow, silent, unstoppable. By the 4th century BC, by the Common Era, the Qin war machine was no longer underestimated. Their generals became legends, their soldiers feared, their walls expanded, and with every conquest they learned not just how to win, but how to rule. I stood at the edge of a shallow ravine once marked as a border between Qin and Wei. The stones had eroded, the markers long gone, but the wind still knew. It carried the memory of voices, of hoofbeats, of swords unsheathed beneath moonlight. Here was where nations once ended, and where a titan began to rise. In the dirt, I found a fragment of a bronze mirror, its surface dulled by centuries. I turned it toward the light and saw only a distorted reflection. The past, it seemed, does not look back clearly, but it does look back. The Qin had not yet claimed the dragon throne, but already the ground trembled beneath their feet. The cave was quiet, carved deep into the lowest cliffs of Shanxi, its mouth hidden by brush and centuries of forgetfulness. Inside, the air was dry and still, as if time itself refused to breathe. My lantern cast shadows against the walls, revealing shelves carved directly into the rock. Upon them lay fragments of bamboo slips, bound once by silk, now curled and cracked with age. These were not poems, not prayers. They were laws, and they were sharp. Legalism. It is a word heavy with judgment in the modern tongue. But in the crucible of the Qin state, it was salvation. In the chaos of the warring states, kindness was weakness, and tradition unreliable. What the Qin needed was something colder, clearer, a doctrine forged not from morality, but from control. The architect of this philosophy was a man named Xianyang. He arrived in the Qin court in the 4th century BCC, a thinker from the East with fire in his mind. He did not speak of virtue, he did not quote the ancients, he spoke of discipline, of standardization, of fear. Where Confucius taught harmony, Xianyang taught obedience. He saw the state as a blade, and he meant to sharpen it. I once held a replica of his legal code, reconstructed from fragments found near the ruins of the Qing court. The text was terrifying in its simplicity: rewards for those who obeyed, death for those who did not. Farmers were prioritized over scholars, soldiers over merchants. Family loyalty meant nothing if it conflicted with the state. Punishments were public, brutal, and absolute. Thieves lost hands. Dissenters lost heads. Even nobles were not spared. In one tale, when the prince's tutor broke a law, Xianyang ordered his execution. The message was clear. No one stood above the system, not even those who shaped it. And yet, there was method in the severity. The Qin state began to transform. Fields were measured and taxed with ruthless efficiency. Roads improved. Armies grew more disciplined. Spies and informants kept entire villages in line. Order was imposed. Chaos receded. One winter morning, while walking the outline of an ancient Qin administrative post, I ran my fingers along the stone pillar once used for public postings, a place where laws were displayed in script that all could read. The characters were deep, angular, final. These were not suggestions, they were declarations. The state no longer pleaded, it commanded. Legalism was not born in the Qin, but here it found its purest form. It became the skeleton of an empire still unborn, a system where morality was replaced with consequences, where loyalty was measured in silence and justice had no heart, only balance. Scholars would later call it cruel, inhuman, but standing there, in the ruins of what was once an island of stability in a sea of war, I could see its terrible logic. The Qin did not seek to be loved, they sought to endure. When Xianyang eventually fell from favor, his own laws ensured his death. Torn apart by chariots, they say, even the creator could not escape the machine he built, but the machine endured. As the rain began to fall outside the cave, I listened to the drops striking stone, each one soft but relentless. That is what legalism was to the Qin. Not a storm, but a steady erosion. Not passion, but permanence. In the flickering light, those brittle bamboo strips whispered truths that Confucian scrolls would never admit. That in some ages, peace does not follow virtue. It follows fear. And in the house of Qin, fear had found its forge. The rain had just lifted when I reached Handan, the ancient capital of Zhao. The streets were quiet, almost reverent. Somewhere beneath the paved roads and open courtyards, a boy had once walked alone, far from home. His name was Ying. He was not yet king, not yet emperor, just a child held hostage in a rival state. That the fire that would one day consume all of China had already begun to burn. Ying was born in the year 259 before the Common Era, into a world fractured by war and deception. His father, Zichu, was a Qin prince stranded in Zhao territory. His mother was a concubine of uncertain origin, possibly from the merchant class. From the beginning, Ying's life was tangled in uncertainty. Even his birth was marked by scandal and rumor. Some whispered he was not the true son of a Qin noble at all. Others said he was marked by fate. At the age of 13, he ascended the Qin throne. Too young to rule in name, yet already watching with the eyes of someone older than his years. The court was filled with vipers, ministers who smiled while sharpening daggers, eunuchs who whispered behind closed doors, regents who saw a child and thought they saw opportunity. But Ying was not like other boys. He listened, he remembered, and he waited. I once stood inside the restored palace gates at Xianyang, where the young king held his first court. The stones there are smooth from centuries of footsteps, but when you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of boots, the rustle of silk, the cold voice of a teenager giving orders to men twice his age. He did not shout, he did not plead, he commanded. Within a few short years, Ying took full control of the court. He removed his regent. Some say the man was exiled, others say he was forced to take his own life. Either way, the message was clear. The boy was no longer a figurehead. He was the storm. From that moment on, the throne was not a symbol. It was a weapon. Ying began reorganizing the state with frightening precision. He brought in new advisors, men not of noble birth, but of proven ambition. He empowered ministers who understood his vision of unity, of order, of permanence. It was said that he rarely laughed, that his presence in court could chill a room, yet the soldiers adored him. They saw in him not just a king, but a leader who would end the centuries of bloodshed, a leader who would stop the cycle of collapse and betrayal. His ambition was not conquest for its own sake, it was transformation. One dusk, I visited a site just outside the capital where an old family claimed Ying once trained with the army. A flat plain, now dotted with wild grass and silent stones. A place where the boy king had watched war games and rehearsed the art of victory. The wind there was strong, carrying the dust eastward, toward the kingdoms he would one day claim. By the time he turned 20, Zheng had already begun reshaping the destiny of a continent. He was not content with being a ruler of Qin. He wanted more, not riches, not even glory. He wanted to be remembered, not as a man, but as a force. The boy was gone. In his place stood a sovereign who saw kingdoms as pieces on a board, and history as something he could carve with his own hand. And he would. The mountains were quiet the morning I crossed into what was once the borderland between Chu and Qin. Mist clung to the treetops, wrapping the old stones in a soft veil of silence. But beneath that stillness I felt it, a tension left behind by marching armies, by treaties broken and thrones overturned. This was where kingdoms ended, and where something far greater began. By the year 221 before the Common Era, Zheng had done what no one before him had achieved. He had conquered all 6 rival states: Zhao, Yan, Han, Wei, Chu, and Qi. Each fell, one after the other. Not to chance, not to luck, but to calculation, to overwhelming force, to vision. He did not call himself king. That title was too small, too fragile. He took a name never used before in the Chinese world: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. With that name, he declared the age of kings was over. The empire had begun. But conquest alone does not make a nation. Zheng knew this. So he began to shape the land in his image. Every corner, every stone, every word. I stood once in an abandoned village where the old script had been etched into a gate stone. Curved, complex, elegant. But beside it, chiseled deeper, was a different script. Sharper, simpler. This was the standardized writing Qin Shi Huang had imposed across the realm. From east to west, north to south, the people would write the same characters. There would be no more confusion, no more dialects of law. The empire would speak with one voice. Weights and measures were next. Before a merchant could travel 100 miles and find his coin worthless, a soldier might find his arrows no longer fit the quiver supplied by another province. The emperor changed that. All coinage was unified. Axle lengths were standardized so carts could travel the same ruts on imperial roads. Even the width of bricks was regulated. Nothing was too small for order. And, of course, the law. The legalist system perfected in Qin now blanketed the entire land. I read a decree once found buried under a collapsed magistrate's hall. It listed punishments for crimes as minor as wearing improper clothing in court. Justice was not blind, it was absolute, and it wore the face of the emperor. But there was something else, something deeper than laws and language. A blade that cut through more than just borders. It was the blade of uniformity. Local customs were suppressed. Nobles from the old states were relocated or executed. Ancestral temples were torn down. The past was not honored, it was buried. I walked the remains of a royal palace once belonging to a Chu noble family. It had been stripped to the foundations, not by time, but by decree. The stones were taken to build Qin fortresses. Even the spirits, it seemed, were made to bow. And yet, there was brilliance in the control. Roads spread like veins connecting distant corners of the empire. Couriers could cross the realm in weeks, not months. Messages traveled faster than armies. The emperor had built a machine, vast, cold, efficient. One morning near the banks of the Yellow River, I watched a fisherman cast his net into the current. His coins, his language, his tools, all shaped by decisions made centuries ago in the court of Qin Shi Huang. The unification had endured, not just as policy, but as identity. The emperor did not just conquer land, he conquered meaning, one script, one law, one blade, and the world would never be the same. The morning sun rose slow over the central plains, casting long shadows across a road older than memory. I knelt beside it, brushing away dust from stone slabs that had once supported carts and armies. The groove down the center was unmistakable. Every axle that passed here was the same width. Every wheel carved the same line. This was not accident, it was design, a legacy of the Qin, a world not just conquered, but calibrated. In the years following unification, Qin Shi Huang did not rest. His war had been one of swords and sieges, but now he turned to a quieter conquest. He would bring order to a land long ruled by difference, and he would do it not with generals, but with uniformity. The emperor understood something others had not. That power is not just about armies, it is about patterns. If every road followed the same plan, if every measure spoke the same truth, then rebellion would not only be punished, it would be harder to imagine. Standardization became his weapon of choice. I visited a restored granary outside the city of Baoji. Inside, I found scales reconstructed from bronze fragments. Every weight bore the same markings issued by the imperial court. No region could cheat another. A pound in the north was the same as a pound in the south. Farmers knew what they owed. Officials knew what they could collect. The flow of grain, tax, and labor no longer depended on trust. It depended on numbers. Even time was brought to heel. The Qin calendar was refined, uniting seasonal rituals and agricultural cycles under a single imperial schedule. Festivals shifted. Planting and harvesting were synchronized. The rhythm of life, once tied to local belief, now beat to the pulse of the central state. And then there were the roads. Hundreds of miles of straight paths cut through mountains and valleys, paved with stone, lined with markers. I walked one stretch for hours, watching how it refused to bend with the terrain. This was not a road built to ease travel. It was built to declare dominance. Couriers galloped along it, their horses kicking up dust that carried imperial commands. Soldiers followed, never lost, never delayed. Across this new spine of stone, the empire could stretch its arms swiftly and without warning. But perhaps the most invisible and most lasting of all these standards was language. Before Qin rule, each region wrote with its own characters, similar in sound but alien in form. The emperor ordered a new script, one that everyone could read. It was called Small Seal Script. Stylized, consistent, it became the script of law, of administration, of permanence. I traced it once on a surviving stele, the characters etched deep and clean. It did not sing like poetry, it commanded like a blade. And the people adapted. Merchants could trade across provinces without fear of fraud. Officials from distant lands could understand each other without a translator. Even punishments were administered the same way. It was not fairness, but it was consistency. Of course, this new order came at a cost. The old characters disappeared. Regional voices fell silent. What had been a mosaic became a pattern. Beautiful, perhaps, but rigid. One evening, as I rested beneath the remains of a Qin way station, I watched a caravan pass by. Their wheels followed grooves carved centuries ago. Their weights matched standards set by a man who had died long before their grandparents were born. They moved forward, unaware they were walking through the mind of an emperor. That is the mark of true power, to shape a world so thoroughly that even in silence it speaks your name. The wind was dry when I reached the edge of what was once Xianyang. The city itself is long gone, buried beneath the soil of centuries, but the land still feels charged, as if it remembers. I stood where the gates once opened, facing the faint outlines of stone roads and foundation stones. There was no grandeur here now, no marble, no banners. But close your eyes, and the city rises again. This was not just a capital, it was the center of a reimagined world. Xianyang began as a modest city on the Wei River, but under Qin Shi Huang, it was transformed into a place of precision and spectacle. The emperor moved thousands of nobles from the conquered states to Xianyang, stripping them of power and bringing them into his shadow. Their palaces were replicated here, brick by brick, but each was smaller than his own. It was theater, power made visible. I walked the remains of one such palace site where a single carved pillar still stood upright in the grass. The details were worn, but you could still see the curled ends of the cloud motifs, symbols of heaven and order. These palaces were not just homes, they were warnings. They said, "Your past is gone, your future belongs to the emperor." The heart of Xianyang was the imperial palace itself, vast and elevated, looking down upon the city like a god surveying his creation. Reports say it stretched for miles, with pavilions, watchtowers, gardens, and audience halls all connected by corridors paved in stone and shadow. Foreign envoys would arrive and be led up long staircases, past bronze statues and giant bells, until they stood trembling before the throne. This was not just a display of might, it was a deliberate illusion. Everything in Xianyang was arranged to remind the viewer that the emperor was no man. He was the axis around which the world turned. In the archives buried nearby, fragments of court records have been uncovered. They detail shipments of lacquer, jade, and silk, taxes collected in grain and copper, edicts written and recopied across districts. The machinery of empire did not rest. It moved through Xianyang like blood through a heart. But not all was ceremony. Hidden behind the courtyards were the forges, the weapon stores, the granaries. Here, the empire was sustained not by ritual, but by labor. I saw remnants of kilns once used to bake tiles for the palace roof. Red clay mixed with ash still litters the hillside. Even beauty in Xianyang was born in fire. At night, they say the city glowed with lanterns. Patrols moved through the streets, watching, listening. The city was not a sanctuary. It was a network of control, a lattice of whispers and fear. Laws were posted at every corner, eyes were everywhere. It was perfect, and it was suffocating. And yet, for a moment, it worked. From this single city, the emperor ruled a realm larger than any before him in Chinese history. Orders moved quickly. Roads fed into its gates. Maps were redrawn daily. Xianyang was the epicenter of a revolution that shaped the very bones of civilization. As I stood there, wind curling through the tall grass, I imagined the sound of court drums in the distance, the shouts of guards, the rustle of silk robes across polished floors. All of it gone now, but not forgotten. Xianyang was more than a capital. It was the vision of one man carved into earth and stone. It was ambition made architecture. A city that rose from dust to command an empire, and would one day return to dust, carrying its secrets with it. The wind howled across the plain outside the ruins of ancient Xianyang, scattering ash and soil into the air. I crouched beside a charred depression in the earth, half forgotten by time. The locals called it the Place of Shadows. No monument marked it, no tablet told its story. But in the layers of blackened soil, I found fragments of bamboo slips, brittle as dried leaves, and the faint scent of something long extinguished. This was once a library, and it had been set on fire. What we now call the burning of the books was not just an act of destruction. It was a turning point, a deliberate fracture in the cultural memory of a civilization. Qin Shi Huang had united China with force, order, and law. But unity of land was not enough. He wanted unity of thought, of loyalty, of belief. The past, in all its complexity and contradiction, was now an obstacle. In the year 213 before the Common Era, the emperor's chief advisor, Li Si, proposed a new policy. One school of thought would be upheld: legalism. All others, especially Confucianism, would be silenced. The classics, the histories, the songs of old dynasties, all were deemed dangerous. They inspired doubt, they bred resistance, and so they were condemned. The emperor agreed. Orders were sent to every region. All privately held books that did not support state doctrine were to be surrendered. Scholars protested. Families hid texts in their walls, buried them beneath floors, wrapped them in cloth, and lowered them into wells. But the agents of the emperor were thorough. I visited a Confucian academy outside Luoyang, where a stone courtyard still bore scorch marks. According to local tradition, this was one of the sites where books were brought in heaps and burned before the people. Fires were lit high. Pages turned to flame, words vanished into smoke. The crackle of burning scrolls echoed like cries. It was not only books that were lost. Later accounts speak of scholars arrested and executed, some buried alive, others forced to labor on imperial projects until their deaths. Their knowledge, their teachings, their lineage severed. The Qin were not only rewriting the present, they were erasing the past. I found a surviving bamboo fragment in a museum vault. It bore only a few characters, faded, incomplete, but they hinted at a verse from the Book of Odes, one of the forbidden texts. Its lines spoke of loyalty to family, the virtue of memory. In another time, those ideas were sacred. Under Qin rule, they were crimes. And yet, in the silence that followed the fire, something strange happened. The fear did not last forever. Some texts survived in whispers, passed down from teacher to student, memorized, recited, hidden. The memory of the past was never completely lost. It smoldered beneath the ashes, waiting. Even the emperor, in time, could not control all thought. His actions sparked fear, but also rebellion. And after his death, the books returned, carried by survivors, preserved in caves and mountain temples. The written word had almost vanished, but it endured. As I left the burned site, the wind kicked up dust around my boots. I looked back once more, trying to picture the flames, the crowds, the silence after the smoke cleared. It was not just scrolls that burned here. It was heritage, identity, voice. The burning of the books was not an accident of war. It was a choice, a war on memory itself. But memory, it seems, has a longer life than empire. The wind bit hard as I climbed the ridge overlooking the desolate northern plains. There was no sound but the whistling of the wind between broken stones. Before me stretched a jagged scar of ancient earth and brick. It snaked across the landscape, vanishing into the horizon. This was no ordinary wall. It was the edge of an idea, the beginning of something monumental, not just in stone, but in suffering. This was where the Great Wall was born. Before the Qin, walls had been built for centuries. Local kingdoms had raised barriers to protect themselves from raiders, from one another, from the unknown. But those were separate lines on a fractured map. Qin Shi Huang did something different. He joined them, not just with mortar, but with intent. He ordered that the older walls be linked and fortified. He commanded the construction of new sections to seal the northern frontier. It was not to defend against armies. It was to hold back the nomads, the Zheng, wild riders of the steppes who could vanish into the grasslands and return like storms. The emperor wanted a border no horse could cross without his leave. But the wall was not built by soldiers. It was built by convicts, by peasants, by those who defied the law or could not pay their taxes. Tens of thousands were taken from their homes, marched north, and given tools or nothing at all. They dug, they lifted, they hauled stone in heat and snow. Many never returned. I stood by a collapsed section near the old Ordos Loop. The ground was littered with crumbled brick and the bone-white remains of lime mortar. Some say that the dead were buried within the wall itself, not in coffins, just dropped where they fell. The Great Wall, they whisper, is not just stone, it is a grave. There are places where you can still see handprints in the dried mud bricks, marks left by the builders pressed into the wall as they worked. I touched one with my palm, aligning fingers with a man who lived over 2,000 years ago. I wondered if he was afraid, if he sang to keep the cold away, if he thought the wall would last. The Qin Wall was not the stone fortress we imagine today. Much of it was tamped earth, layered and beaten until it hardened like rock. In the northern light, it glows a dull gold. In moonlight, it looks like the spine of some ancient beast curled across the hills. But more than a wall, it was a statement. It declared the edge of civilization. Inside lay order, language, law. Outside, the wild. The emperor was drawing a line not just across geography, but across culture. He would decide where the empire ended and where the chaos began. The cost was terrible. Whole villages vanished. Fathers never returned. Sons were taken before their voices deepened. And yet, the wall rose, foot by foot, day by day. No monument was built to the workers. No names carved in stone. Only the wall remains, silent and enduring. I spent the night camped beside one ruined tower, its top long gone, its steps worn smooth. In the darkness, I heard nothing but wind, and I thought of the hands that shaped this frontier, the lives folded into its foundation. The Great Wall did not begin as a wonder of the world. It began as labor, as punishment, as sacrifice. But it endures. Not because of glory, but because of what it cost. The mist clung thick over Mount Li as I followed a narrow path into the forest. The trees grew close here, branches arching overhead like ribs. The air smelled of moss and wet stone. Somewhere beneath my feet, hidden deep within the earth, lay a tomb said to be filled with rivers of mercury, a palace for the dead. This was the final resting place of Qin Shi Huang, but it was never meant to be a tomb. It was meant to be a beginning. The emperor did not believe in endings. From the moment he unified China, Qin Shi Huang began a second conquest, one not of territory, but of time. He wanted to defeat death, not in memory, not in legacy, but literally. He sought to live forever. It began with medicine, Court alchemists prepared strange potions, elixirs of jade and gold, cinnabar and pearl. Some came from the mountains, others from faraway islands whispered of in legend. Many were deadly. The emperor consumed them anyway. I saw a set of bronze mixing vessels recovered from one such laboratory, green with age but still reeking faintly of sulfur. On the inside, traces of mercury lingered. The alchemists believed it held the secret to life. In truth, it may have helped bring about his death. But the emperor did not rely only on potions. He sent out expeditions in search of sacred lands and hidden sages. One of the most famous was led by a man named Xu Fu. Charged with finding the Isles of the Immortals, Xu Fu sailed east with hundreds of boys and girls, scholars and artisans. They never returned. Some say they reached Japan. Others say they vanished into myth. Perhaps that was the emperor's plan all along, to chase legends until they became truth. I visited an ancient harbor once linked to these voyages. The stones there had been smoothed by centuries of tides, but I could still imagine the sails, the prayers, the quiet terror in the eyes of those leaving behind the only world they had ever known. They were chasing eternity for someone else. Meanwhile, beneath Mount Li, work continued. For decades, artisans and laborers carved a city underground, a mausoleum larger than anything built before it. According to historical texts, it included constellations on the ceiling, palaces and towers, and flowing rivers of liquid mercury to mimic the geography of China. The entire empire shrunk and buried, waiting. None who built it ever left. They were sealed inside, their knowledge entombed to protect the emperor in death, as they had in life. I walked the perimeter of the site, now off limits to excavation. The ground trembles slightly there. Some say it is from the high mercury levels. Others say it is something else, waiting. The emperor's obsession was not madness, it was certainty. He had defied the chaos of the warring states, bent the world to his will. Why should death be any different? If walls could stop armies, if law could control minds, why not bind the soul? But in the end, no elixir worked. No island revealed its secret. The emperor died on the road during an inspection tour, far from his palace, far from his tomb, and the world he tried to conquer began to unravel. And yet, beneath the mountain, his vision remains. Not just a grave, but a map of eternity, a final act of control in a world that slips, always, toward the unknown. He could not defeat death, but he built a monument trying. The earth opened quietly in the spring of 1974. Farmers digging a well struck something hard. At first, they thought it was just stone. Then, a head emerged, lifelike and watchful. What they had found was not a relic, it was a sentinel. And behind it stood an entire army, buried for over 2,000 years. I stood in Pit 1 at dawn, when the museum was quiet and the shadows still clung to the corners. Row after row of warriors stood in formation, silent and unblinking. There were thousands, infantrymen, archers, cavalry, charioteers, each one unique, each one built to serve a master in death. This was the Terracotta Army, the underground garrison of Qin Shi Huang. While the emperor pursued immortality through alchemy and legend, he also prepared for the afterlife with precision. He may have feared death, but he intended to meet it on his own terms, with command, with force, with order. The figures were crafted with astonishing detail. I moved slowly past them, noting the differences in expression, the folds in their robes, the braids in their hair. Some looked stern, others calm, A few seemed almost curious. These were not copies, these were individuals, or at least the idea of individuals, bound forever in clay. And it was not just soldiers. There were musicians, acrobats, strongmen, courtiers, even animals. Everything the emperor had in life, he demanded in death. He did not plan to pass into the next world alone. He brought his world with him. The scale of the army is staggering. Current estimates suggest over 8,000 figures, many still buried. The pits stretch out like a vast shadow beneath the fields of Shaanxi. Entire sections remain untouched, not from lack of curiosity, but from reverence and caution. I spoke with a researcher who told me that many of the pigments on the figures vanish upon contact with air. What was once brilliant red, vivid green, and striking blue fades in hours. The army we see today is only a ghost of its original splendor, but even in muted earth tones, they command the space. The methods used to create them were advanced. Modular techniques allowed the rapid production of parts, later assembled and customized. Arms, legs, heads, and torsos were crafted separately, then joined and detailed by skilled artisans. The result was an army that looked alive. But there is something else in their stillness, something unsettling. As I stood among the ranks, I felt the weight of their purpose. They were not made for display, they were guardians. Warriors crafted not to inspire, but to protect. Not the living, the dead. And they were buried with care. Rows organized by role. Chariots aligned for speed. Officers positioned at the front. It was a strategic layout designed not just as tribute, but as readiness. As if the emperor feared that death itself might require a battle. No written records from the Qin era mention the Terracotta Army. No official account survives. It was a secret, a silent force hidden from history until accident revealed it. That secrecy speaks volumes. This was not a monument to be seen. It was a power never meant to fade, a force placed between the emperor and the unknown, guarding his soul through eternity. As I left the pit and stepped into the morning light, I looked back once more. The warriors did not move. They did not speak, but they watched. And in that silence, I understood. The emperor may have died, but he left behind an army that still stands, waiting. The road curved endlessly through the countryside, winding past forests, rivers, and ancient stones weathered by time. It was along this road, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, that the most powerful man in China drew his final breath. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, did not die with ceremony. He died in motion, far from home, far from the tomb he had spent a lifetime preparing. The year was 210 before the Common Era. The emperor had embarked on one of his many inspection tours. Restless and watchful, he feared rebellion, he feared betrayal. But most of all, he feared death. He carried with him elixirs brewed by alchemists, promising immortality. Ironically, those very concoctions, heavy with mercury and poison, may have hastened the very end he sought to escape. The exact place of his death is still debated. Somewhere near the sands of Hebei, they say. The caravan stopped, the attendants grew silent, and the man who had united China was gone. But no one could know, not yet. The emperor's chief advisor, Li Si, and the eunuch Xiao Go, both traveling with him, were gripped not by grief, but by fear. If news of the emperor's death spread, chaos could ignite, power would fracture, so they concealed it. For weeks, they continued the journey as if nothing had changed. The emperor's carriage remained sealed. Orders were issued in his name, Rations of dried fish were placed inside the wagon to mask the smell of decay. It was a gruesome charade, but it bought them time. I walked a section of that old road once, now quiet and overgrown. The wind whispered through tall grass, and I imagined the slow creaking wheels of the imperial carriage. Inside, the lifeless body of a man who had ruled like a god. Outside, the illusion of control stretched thin. Behind the silence was a plot. Li Si and Zhao Gao feared the emperor's eldest son, Fusu, who had been exiled to the frontier. They forged a decree in the emperor's name, commanding Fusu to take his own life. He obeyed. With the rightful heir eliminated, the conspirators placed the younger son, Hu Hai, on the throne, a pliable figure, more puppet than ruler. When the caravan finally reached Xianyang, the truth emerged. The emperor was dead. The empire trembled. The death of Qin Shi Huang marked the beginning of the end. Without his iron will, the carefully balanced system began to crumble. Revolts sparked across the provinces. Old loyalties resurfaced. The dream of unity, held together by force and fear, started to fray. I visited a temple once said to have been built on the spot where the news of his death was first announced. The stone steps were worn smooth. The air was heavy. It was not a place of triumph. It was a place of reckoning. For all his power, the emperor could not outrun mortality. He had built walls across deserts, roads across kingdoms, armies of clay to guard him beyond the veil. But death came not in a throne room, but on a lonely road. And in that quiet passing, the empire he forged began to dissolve. Yet the story does not end there, because even in death, Qin Shi Huang remains. In the road still followed, in the script still written, in the very name of China itself derived from Qin. He could not escape fate, but he shaped it forever. The throne room stood cold in my mind as I stepped through the ruins of the old Qin capital. Once its halls echoed with orders that could reshape a kingdom. But after the death of Qin Shi Huang, those walls bore only whispers, and the hesitant steps of a boy who was never meant to rule. His name was Hu Hai, the second emperor of Qin, and he was no sovereign, he was a shadow. Hu Hai's ascent to power was born not from tradition, but from deception. While the emperor's body was still decaying in a sealed carriage, the court minister Li Si and the eunuch Zhao Gao forged an imperial decree. In it, the rightful heir, Fusu, was commanded to die. He obeyed, and Hu Hai, the younger son, was placed on the throne. He was likely in his early 20s, young, inexperienced, unprepared, but useful. Zhao Gao knew this. He had raised Hu Hai within the palace, molding him with quiet purpose. Where Qin Shi Huang had ruled with will and vision, Hu Hai ruled with fear and confusion. He relied entirely on Zhao Gao, whose influence grew unchecked. Orders came through the eunuch's voice. Decisions were whispered into Hu Hai's ears and spoken back as law. I visited a hillside temple that once overlooked the imperial court. From there, a monk told me, one could hear the horns of procession and later the cries of execution. Under Hu Hai, the punishments increased. The paranoia deepened. The laws did not change, but their purpose did. The state no longer served the people. It served the panic of a collapsing dynasty. Hu Hai feared rebellion. He feared dissent. So he struck first. Ministers were executed on suspicion alone. Generals disappeared. Entire families vanished in the night. Some records say over 700 officials were purged in a single wave. It was not justice. And outside the palace, the people began to stir. The burden of the Great Wall, the Grand Tomb, and endless taxes had pushed the common folk to their breaking point. Revolts sparked like dry brush in summer. In the east, in the south, in the plains of Chu, uprisings spread. Hu Hai did not ride out to meet them. He did not speak to his people. He hid behind walls while his empire unraveled. I stood once at a village said to be the birthplace of one rebel leader. The locals still remember the name Chen Shum. He had been a low-ranking officer, nothing more. But his words ignited fire. He said, "A noble does not have to be born into nobility. Under Hu Hai, even the forgotten found purpose." The Qin forces began to fracture. Loyalty faltered. Generals surrendered or turned coat. What had taken decades to build was collapsing in months. And at the heart of the palace, Hu Hai could only watch. Power, once absolute, had slipped through his fingers. Zhao Gao, the man who placed him on the throne, now feared his instability. And so, according to the histories, he forced the young emperor to take his own life. A silent end to a hollow reign. Hu Hai's rule lasted less than 3 years. No monuments bear his name. No victories mark his time. He was remembered not as a ruler, but as a warning. A throne, after all, does not grant wisdom. It reveals it. And in Hu Hai, there was nothing left to reveal. Just a puppet. And a crown too heavy for his hands. The skies had darkened over the plains of Chu. I stood beside a shallow ravine where riverbeds once flooded roads and turned fields to muck. The locals still point to this place, whispering of a storm that changed the world. Not one of thunder and rain, but of rebellion. A revolution sparked not by generals or kings, but by 2 common soldiers soaked to the bone, caught in the mud, and pushed too far. Their names were Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. It began in the summer of 209 before the Common Era. A small escort of conscripts was en route to the northern frontier. The Qin system demanded exact punctuality. Missing a deadline meant death. And when storms flooded the roads, the men fell behind schedule. They had a choice: continue and be executed for failure, or turn their backs on the empire. They chose fire. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang rallied their fellow soldiers and declared open rebellion. It was the first crack in the seemingly indestructible armor of the Qin. No one expected it to matter. But the timing, the fury, the desperation across the land, all conspired to make this spark ablaze. I traced the trail of their uprising moving through villages where old tales are still sung at festival time. They speak of banners raised in fields, of drums echoing through the valleys, of men with nothing but farming tools rising up against trained soldiers. This was not an army, it was a movement, born not from strategy, but from suffering. And it spread fast. All across China, the weight of the Qin system had become unbearable. Families broken by labor conscription, fields ruined by endless demands, voices silenced for decades now roared. Local leaders, warlords, even former Qin officers began switching sides. Some sought freedom, others smelled opportunity. In the south, Shang Liang and his nephew Shang Yu, both descendants of the old Chu nobility, raised their own forces. In the north, Liu Bong, a low-level officer and former peasant, began to gather support. Each new revolt was different, but they shared one thing: a hunger to erase Qin rule from the map. I stood in a ruined watchtower along one of the old Qin roads, its walls blackened by fire. Arrowheads still littered the ground, rusted and half buried in the dirt. There had been no siege here, just abandonment. As rebellion spread, Qin garrisons fell without resistance. The soldiers, once feared, no longer fought with conviction. They had lost not just battles, but belief. And still, the court in Xianyang refused to act. Hu Hai remained isolated, buried beneath paranoia. His advisors issued commands that no one followed. The empire had become a phantom, present in name only. What was once a single empire had become dozens of fronts. Uprising met uprising. Alliances shifted like sand. It was chaos, but also possibility. One afternoon, I walked the bank of a river near Danyang, where Liu Bang first rallied his forces. The water moved slow and steady, but the land around it had seen flames. Here, a village had risen against a local magistrate, and won. A farmer's son now wore a sword. A scribe now gave orders. The Qin Dynasty had crushed kingdoms. It had burned books and silenced doubt, but it could not crush hunger. It could not erase memory. And in the end, it could not stop a storm carried not by armies, but by ordinary hands. The revolts had ignited, and the fire would not be put out. The sun was low when I reached the outskirts of modern-day Xianyang. The fields were quiet, the soil thick with memory. Beneath my boots, the ground once held the most powerful city in all of China, a capital built to command a continent. But now, there were only broken stones, scattered bricks, and whispers buried in the dust. This was where the empire ended, not in glory, but in smoke. The Fall of Xianyang was not a single battle. It was a slow unraveling. Years of rebellion, misrule, and betrayal had eaten away at the Qin from within. And as the revolts spread like wildfire, the walls of the imperial court began to crack. Inside the palace, the second emperor, Hu Hai, had collapsed under the weight of his own fear. His reign ended not with resistance, but with a forced suicide orchestrated by the same advisor who had placed him on the throne. Power then passed briefly to a puppet emperor, Ying, a distant relative with little authority and even less support. By then, the dynasty was running on echoes. Outside the city, a new force had risen. Liu Bang, once a minor official, now led a growing rebel army. He was no noble, no warlord from old blood, but he understood the people. His forces moved swiftly through the countryside, offering protection, fair treatment, and freedom from Qin brutality. City after city opened its gates to him without a fight. When he reached the walls of Xianyang, they did not resist. The capital, worn by fear and fire, surrendered. I stood on the hill where Liu Bang is said to have first looked down upon the city. In his journals, he described entering peacefully. There was no pillage, no destruction. He declared an end to executions, an end to forced labor. And for a moment, the city breathed. But peace did not last. Zheng Yu, another rebel leader and powerful general, arrived soon after. His forces outnumbered Liu Bang's. He took control of the capital with fire in his heart and vengeance in his hands. And where Liu Bang had spared the city, Zheng Yu chose to erase it. Xianyang was burned. Palaces collapsed in flame. Archives filled with centuries of knowledge were consumed by smoke. The imperial treasury was looted. Statues melted. Towers fell. And with them, the illusion of eternity that the Qin had tried so desperately to build. I visited the remains of a water channel that once fed the palace gardens. Now it is dry, choked with weeds and time. I ran my fingers along the stone, blackened by fire. A single character was still visible, partially melted, almost unreadable. It meant rule. In the end, Xianyang did not fall to an enemy army. it fell to the weight of its own ambition. The city was a monument to control, every stone placed by decree, every gate watched, every voice measured. But control cannot outlive the people who no longer believe in it. And when that belief died, so did the city. The streets that once echoed with royal commands now whispered with ash. The walls that once guarded the emperor now stood open to the sky, and the vision of a unified, eternal empire crumbled into ruin. Xianyang was not just a capital, it was the dream of the Qin made real. Its fall was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an age, and in its silence, a new chapter waited to be written. The rain had just begun when I reached the northern edge of what was once the heartland of Qin. The sky hung low, heavy with mist, and the trees stood still like sentinels guarding the silence. I paused beside a crumbling stone marker half swallowed by earth and moss. There were no names left on it, no dates. But it was once a border post of an empire that tried to last forever. It did not. And yet, the Qin Dynasty ruled for only 15 years, a flicker in the long stretch of history. But what it forged in that short time shaped the identity of China for millennia. Even today, the name Qin echoes in the word China. Their legacy was not just written in law, but carved into the bones of a civilization. They brought unity to a land fractured by war. One currency, one script, one legal system, one language of power. For the first time, there was an empire under heaven that answered to a single voice. That voice may have been harsh, it may have been feared, but it was clear. I walked through a museum gallery once filled with Qin relics. Bronze weights, iron tools, standardized coins stamped with square holes. It struck me how ordinary they looked. Practical, meant to be used. The Qin were not builders of beauty, they were engineers of control. And yet, there was something beautiful in that design, a symmetry to their ambition, a purpose in every detail. The Dragon Throne, as it came to be called in later dynasties, was born here. Qin Shi Huang was the first to claim the mantle of emperor, not just king. He was the first to rule not as a man among equals, but as a figure above all. His title became the model for every dynasty that followed. But legacy is not only found in structures and systems, it is found in warnings. The Qin taught later emperors a lesson that echoed across dynasties. That harsh rule may unify, but it does not last. That fear may build walls, but it cannot hold a people. The Qin rose with unmatched speed and fell just as swiftly. Their flame burned too hot, too fast, and left behind only smoke. I stood on a hill once used as a military outpost, now reclaimed by grass and wind. Below me stretched the land that had once bowed to Qin rule. Roads still traced their ancient paths. Villages still bore names given during their reign, but the empire itself had vanished. Not just toppled, forgotten by time, until we unearthed its shadow. And yet, the after-image remains. Han China, which followed the Qin, kept many of its foundations. The bureaucracy, the script, the roads. They softened the laws, honored the past, and wove stories around the harshness of Qin rule. But they never questioned the idea of empire again. That seed had been planted, and it grew. In every centralized dynasty, in every debate about order and chaos, in every emperor who wore the dragon robe and sat upon a throne shaped like heaven, the Qin watched silently, through time. As I packed my notes and stepped away from the last marker stone, the rain began to fall harder. The drops struck the earth like memory returning. The Qin are gone, but their echo has never left. They were not the end of a story. They were the beginning of an empire's long conversation with itself. The dragon throne still stands, and it remembers who first dared to build it. The wind had shifted by the time I left the heartlands of the Qin. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long beams across the hills where once the emperor's banners flew. I paused at the edge of an old watchtower, just a silhouette now, barely standing. From here, I could see the ghost of a nation that had once dared to bind the world to its will. The Qin Dynasty was brief, brutal, unyielding, but in its short breath of time, it remade the shape of history. It showed what unity could look like and what it could cost. It offered a vision of a world ruled by law, by order, by the iron clarity of a single voice. And it paid the price when that voice fell silent. Yet its legacy did not vanish. Every stone road that stretches across China, every character written by hand in a classroom, every idea of central rule and imperial order carries the fingerprint of Qin. The dynasty may have died, but the dream it began lived on. It was carried by the Han, echoed in every throne that followed. The idea that a land so vast could be drawn together, that a people so many could be made one. I think often of the emperor's tomb, still untouched beneath Mount Li, still sealed, still waiting. They say it holds rivers of mercury and stars of precious stone. They say it holds the shape of the empire itself, frozen in time. But maybe it holds something else. A question. What does it mean to rule forever? The first emperor tried, with walls, with warriors of clay, with laws etched in unbending lines. But even he could not escape the gravity of time, and yet, the silence he left behind still speaks. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I have learned one thing on this path. History does not whisper, it waits, and somewhere, beneath stone and ash and story, it remembers.